Welcome to another spooky episode of My Friend the Rainbow Circle. So I'm doing an idiosyncratic top 10. I don't know if the lamp sitting right there is going to work. Spooky. And they're chewing plastic again. This is all day. Just chewing things and chewing things. It's going to turn out like Yellow Brick Road. But one of the ones I kind of have to mention after I take the plastic away. One of the ones I have to mention, yes, I took the plastic away, is the Blob, the 1988 Blob. And I don't really ever see that on top 10 lists. So if you're first joining us, this might be a very confusing, chaotic situation. Okay, stay right there. You're a bit of a blob yourself. So my idiosyncratic top 10 horror list. The rules are that it can't be something that's canon. And you might argue, just maybe for monster movies, the original Blob might be canon. I don't know. Maybe not the 1988 version. I'm grading papers all day. I'm doing these for my grandkids partly, and they'll say, "Why does our grandfather always have pins in his ear?" It's because I spend all day grading papers. Just a giant stack of papers. But anyway, so the Blob was a big influence on me. It's one of my favorite horror movies when I was a kid also. Starring Shawnee Smith, one of my favorite horror movie actresses. I unapologetically love the Saw films. She was Amanda in the Saw films. I think the Saw films are really underrated for just their greatness. Probably one of the Saw movies will end up on this list, but the criteria are something that's not canon, that doesn't end up on lists. Usually something that's not obscure, and I'm picking it just to sound cool. How can I possibly be cool if I'm picking the 1988? Blob, I genuinely love it, but it's definitely not one of those that has the cachet of being so obscure it's cool. And ironic distance. So, disregarding ironic distance, and that's definitely one where, I mean, it's not a perfect movie, but I would say my love for it comes from irony. But I think Blob movies, and I would probably lump The Stuff in there. I think I might have seen The Stuff on some list, just because The Stuff is a great movie. About the same time, it might have been the same year, I don't know. But The Stuff is super fun movie. It shows up on lists sometimes. It was an Easter egg in one of the episodes of Stranger Things, I think season 3. The one where they were in the movie theater so much, that was season 3. It showed up as an Easter egg in the background. I think it's one of those obscure ones that, if you name drop The Stuff, that might be a hipster one. The Stuff is great, though. I mean, no offense. It's just the original Blob and The Stuff. The Stuff, which is a satire of the original Blob. But that 1988, The Blob with Shawnee Smith, it's awesome. It's an awesome movie. But I think part of what makes Blob movies like that so appealing is that there's a menace, and that's just at the core of your essential horror movies. So you're being stalked by a menace of some kind that's making you feel vulnerable, and your empathetic experience with the menace, whether it's a monster, whether it's a stalker, it really triggers that very primal, very animalistic fight or flight instinct that heightens your visceral stimulation. Visceral stimulation right here in the center. It really spikes that up to a significant degree. What's the most basic kind of visceral stimulation? The fight or flight instinct. The basic survival drive to keep you alive. I didn't mean to rhyme right there. So tons of horror movies will have just people running away from something menacing. And what are you scared of? I'm trying to move you. So sit still. What are you scared of? Just by coincidence, the cat is scared of something. I'm trying to Just sit still. There you go. This is Bo. She's needy and skittish. So anyway, you'd be a good final girl, but you are a little bit skittish. She looks very confused. What are you so confused by? It's just me. Nothing to be scared of. I hope. But anyway, so the Blob movies, they take that same basic dynamic of, running away from a monster or a menace. And other movies will make it something, relatively realistic. Like Michael Myers is not, he comes back from the dead constantly, but in purely relative terms, it's a realistic sort of a menace. There are plenty of other, fairly realistic movies like that. Like Psycho or something like that. Where it's just a human being. And there are plenty of monster movies, especially in the 80s. There were lots of Thrasher movies and lots of monster movies. Like Pumpkinhead. Pumpkinhead is a classic, but that shows up in a bunch of movies. Just amazing creature design there, but it's that very animalistic sort of a fear of, some sort of predator coming after you. Sit still. Some sort of predator coming after you, whether it looks like Pumpkinhead or whether it looks like, just an actual human being. It's still that baseline visceral stimulation. Whereas the Blob movies really just make it much more abstract, more viscerally abstract. And I would argue there's really two types of abstraction. There's the cerebral abstraction at this end of the spectrum, designed for destimulation. So if you said the Blob is more abstract, you would be talking about mathematically abstract. And mathematical abstraction is designed very specifically to decrease stimulation. But visceral abstraction is designed to increase stimulation. So if you consider abstract expressionism, so a blob is an abstract terror in the same sense that a Jackson Pollock painting, most famously, or a Mark Rothko painting, is viscerally stimulating on an entirely irrational level. It doesn't really have any shape, doesn't really have any, discernible relationship with anything you can recognize. Maybe mold spores and fungus, unintentional Ghostbusters reference there. But it's purely this disassociated, undifferentiated tissue. Burroughs reference, of course, I'm going to make a Ghostbusters reference and a William S. Burroughs reference, in the same presentation. But I think that's what is fascinating about a blob as a menace is how it's undifferentiated. It's like pure menace, and it absorbs you in a way that is not violent in the same way. Of course, Ghostbusters 2 had blob references in it too, but it's for very different function. But it's not violent in the same way a monster is, a thrasher or a creature. It just sucks you in and absorbs you. And I think that's just a beautiful sort of image, a beautiful, very different from your average monster. The Stuff took that and made it just absolutely ridiculous. I love The Stuff. It's a ton of fun to watch. But it's riffing on 80s consumerist crazes, and it's a satire of consumerism, and you have a lot of 80s horror movies that are like Chopping Mall, stuff like that are just riffing on 80s hyper consumerism. And so, Dawn of the Dead, obviously probably the biggest one. But you can look at that, and that's the sort of movie where it seems like, really obviously there's a satirical political message to it. But it's one of those where I would say the takeaway from The Stuff is not necessarily that all horror movies have this political message. That's commonly what people would will lay over, Thrasher movies. They'll say Thrasher movies are designed to scare kids away from all these different behaviors. And I don't think any kid who ever watched a Thrasher movie would say, "Oh, I understand now. If I do those behaviors, somebody's going to come out of the woods and stab me with a machete." So that is a tendency, and the tendency to overlay that sort of political message comes from the outer rim of the rainbow circle, the need to destimulate it. If you see this really intensely visceral image of a killer coming out of the woods and killing all these kids in a camp, I'm of course referencing Friday the 13th, then your tendency to interpret that is really rooted in your need to destimulate it. And by overlaying that sort of idea that there must be a message to it, is really just a destimulating strategy and has no necessary relationship with any sort of actual message. Whereas the value of it from an artistic perspective is the structure of the story of balancing that spike in visceral stimulation with relatively low connection with most of the characters, relatively heightened connection with the final girl or whoever the main character is. So that particular structure is designed to optimize visceral stimulation. That's much more significant than any sort of political messaging. The stuff, on the other hand, is really overtly satirically about that. So it sort of displaces the actual menace. I mean, the stuff isn't scary. I don't know who would watch the stuff and say, "Oh, that was terrifying." They would say, "Oh, that was hilarious and over the top and ridiculous." But the stuff is overtly about that. I mean, it's like a yogurt type of thing that people are selling, and it turns out to be a blob creature that eats people. Hilarious. If that's not a selling point for the whole movie, just that premise, I don't know what is. But and I took that. That's one I kind of ripped off. I wrote a story called Pink Bellies. It sort of mixes the two. I mean, the stuff never quite has that same dynamic as the original 1988 Blob. But people buy this type of Debbie cake. In South Carolina, we call them Debbie cakes, hostess cakes. I don't know, whatever you call them in whatever region of the country you're coming from. But in South Carolina, we call them all Debbie cakes. But this kind of Debbie cake, like this pink snowballs, these people buy this, and it turns into a monster and eats everybody. And it's a blob, and it sort of takes over the mind. It's a fun story. I should finish editing that story one of these days. But if you take the Mogon to that, my method of determining, looking at two stories, and that's a real simple one to do. If you look at the Blob and if you look at the stuff, the menace is, if you say the stuff has any kind of menace at all, but the menace is very similar. It's this blobby creature eating people. This viscerally abstract blobby creature eating people. And if you just looked at the stuff, you might come to the conclusion that all good stories have a political message. But then, if you use the Mogon scheme and say, can I take that particular claim that all good stories have a political message? Would that be my first impression watching the Blob, or would I be forcing that onto the Blob? Would that be my first impression watching Friday the 13th? Am I forcing that on? But the test is just if that was the only movie that existed. If the stuff was the only movie that existed, you would say, yeah, I mean, good stories. I mean, if you enjoy the stuff, I love the stuff, but good movies. If that's the only movie that existed, you say, why is this good? Oh, it's good because the political message is, that satirical political message is enjoyable. It's lots of fun. It really pokes fun at these people and the hyper 80s yuppies. But if that's the message that you take from it and you say that must apply to all movies, could you honestly say if the Blob was the only movie that existed, you would come to the same conclusion? If Friday the 13th was the only movie that existed, would you come to the same conclusion? But if you said what makes those enjoyable is a menace from this, a deep level visceral predatory menace, heightening our fear of it. That makes the stuff, that heightens the fun of the stuff. There's little jump scares and stuff like that here and there. But you can definitely take the Blob, and you could take Friday the 13th and say, that's what's enjoyable about them, that sort of visceral, that core visceral predatory instinct. The stuff as a satire, this gets into a different schema. If you have a very different answer to that, probably you're in a different schema, you're in a different genre. And arguably, the stuff is a different genre. It's using the superficial images of a horror film and coming to a different, eliciting a different visceral response. And so, arguably, and this gets into a whole other argument, it has really nothing to do with horror movies, but arguably, the reason the stuff works is not because the blobby parts of it are scary. The stuff works because, for a reason that is somewhat similar to what I talked about, where it's breaking down the facade, where, Thrasher movies, you'll have a character who has this facade of normalcy and breaks that down and accesses this really animalistic side. Satirical movies will take characters who have this facade, yuppies, for example, and it will put them in a situation that does break down that facade, but the ultimate visceral response that it elicits is not fear necessarily. I mean, the stuff is not eliciting fear, it's eliciting a laugh, for example. And you can elicit a laugh by doing that. Someone who's very arrogant and full of themselves, who puts on this facade of normalcy, if you break that down and reveal they're just animalistic, they're just human beings, with all these foibles, if they're maintaining that facade, that could, if they're striving hard to maintain that facade despite what is obviously this really human, animalistic sort of side of them that gets revealed, that's what makes it humorous. And I talked about playing drunk. That playing drunk example is for a humorous effect. So it's, if somebody who's drunk is trying not to be drunk and trying hard to really maintain that facade of normalcy and fitting in, to the crowd, that usually has a comedic effect. Whereas if you look at the final girl, is pushed to the brink and is forced to embrace this more animalistic side. She's no longer trying to maintain the facade of normalcy. But if you imagine the end of a Thrasher movie, if the final girl is still trying to act like she was at the beginning of the movie, that could be comedic for sure. But then, so you break down, it's not necessarily the political satire that is universally the core value of all stories, and trying to put that on, trying to overlay that over, Friday the 13th. It's forced. It doesn't really work. It's not really the reason we enjoy Friday the 13th. But definitely overtly it is a big part of the stuff. It's the purpose of the stuff. But the takeaway is that, that's just an incidental part of the stuff, but the core value is that visceral stimulation, that animalistic predatory visceral stimulation, and the elimination of the facade. Visceral stimulation, elimination of the facade. That's what makes a pure story. And that's the takeaway. And what am I going to choose next? What should I choose next, Siku? I don't know. The Blob and the Stuff are so great. How can you top that? How can anything better be better than the Blob and the Stuff? We'll see. Because I don't actually know. We'll see in the next episode.